Professor Poast, now that everything kind of like the dust settled a bit, we're seeing kind of the pieces of the puzzle just joining together. And now moving forward, what does this say? What does this whole situation say about the Russian government, their position? What does it say about Vladimir Putin's power? And what does it say about the future of the Russia-Ukraine war in a whole? You also mentioned the elites in Russia supporting Putin, if I'm not mistaken. It seemed that they didn't back off. Is this still happening? What is your take in all of these variables?
So I think the key thing that I've been noticing in terms of the implications of this and where this is taking things. So there were a lot of folks who viewed this as the beginning of the end, right? That it's like, this is clearly going to undermine, and I think it is true, this has undermined Putin and his credibility in many ways for reasons that we just talked about. I mean, the simple fact that he was willing to just say, you know what, I know it was an insurrection, but we're going to let it go. We're not going to press charges. It does suggest some weakness. And again, as we already talked about, I think weakness predicated on, kind of material interest. He needs these personnel. And so what that has led to is it's led people to say this points to the beginning of the end, that Putin, there's these fissures in Russian support. There's these fissures in Russian society, military support, even in the elite support. And so that is going to create conditions where this war is going to end. And that's at least what I saw a lot of the initial narrative about. But I think that Putin's weakness and the fact that this is illustrated weakness on the part of Putin actually points in the opposite direction. And the reason why is, and again, to be clear, it's not because I think Putin is stronger now than he was last week. I don't think that at all. I do agree that he is weaker, but I think that actually creates a dangerous situation. Because due to him being weaker, it can lead to a situation that we refer to as gambling for resurrection. And what this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It is you are willing to take extreme measures in order to ensure that you stay alive. And by alive, that can mean literally alive, but it can also mean your political life. And authoritarian leaders are particularly susceptible to doing this because they can have great fear about their post-leadership life, right? For a lot of leaders, when you leave office, say in a democracy, you go on and write your memoirs and start the speaking circuit and all those kind of things. Again, most leaders, not everybody, but most do this. But for authoritarian leaders, especially ones who engage in wars, there could be a lot of concern about that if the war goes poorly, you can be held liable for that. And that can result in not just prison, but even execution afterwards. And so that can induce a leader to take more extreme measures and to actually hold on. And that can actually lead to the war lengthening as opposed to shortening. A leader who feels pretty strong in their position domestically might say, we don't need to win this war. I will be fine. We could end this war and, to just reach a deal. I'm sure, people will criticize me for reaching a deal, but you know what? It's fine. I'm in a steady position. Or I'm in a stable position. But if you're not in a stable position, if you feel like you're politically vulnerable, well, and Putin is now more vulnerable, he's even less likely to accept some sort of deal that would end it. Because now he knows he looks weak. He feels like he has to look even more resolved, even stronger, because he has to take these kind of desperate actions to maintain his political life, which in turn can actually go to his real life. So that is why I think this actually creates conditions for the war to be prolonged, even though it points to weaknesses within Russia and it points to difficulties in their war effort and it points to kind of this undermining of Putin himself. That actually creates conditions for him to be more likely to continue fighting rather than less likely to continue fighting. And that's why I think this was not the kind of hopeful thing that maybe people were pointing to or at least the initial reaction that folks had about it.
Wow, that's really interesting, Professor. And I'm going to link your post in World Politics Review. You just published it today, June 30th. The Wagner mutiny will probably prolong the war in Ukraine, where you go in depth into what you just spoke today, right now. So thank you. You mentioned these extreme tactics or extreme measures an authoritarian leader could do. And now we're talking about Putin, who has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the entire globe and is waging a war. Some are saying a proxy war with the US. I don't know your perspective on that, if that's a legitimate take, a legitimate perspective on what's happening in Ukraine. But I'm curious, what are some of, in your mind, what are some of these extreme measures that are feasible in Putin's eyes? And what are some that concern you and, your whole take on these extreme measures?
So I think I think it's absolutely correct to focus on the nuclear question, right? Because I think that is the big thing. That's the most extreme measure. I think what's more practical, or not, I don't want to say practical, though it is practical from Putin's standpoint, but the most likely measure is just continuation of the war, unwillingness to back down, unwillingness to reach some sort of settlement with Ukraine. I think that is what is the most likely scenario. But we absolutely need to talk about the possible use of a nuclear weapon. The probability is still low, or it's not an and, it's a but. It's still low, but two things. Number one, when you're talking about nuclear weapons, you care about low probabilities, right? Because if it happens, it's devastating. And number two, it's low, but I do think it's rising. And I think it's been rising throughout the war. That the more desperate Putin becomes, the more likely it is that he could resort to utilizing a nuclear weapon. Now, I don't think he would use what we would call a strategic nuclear weapon, meaning he's going to drop a bomb on Kyiv or a NATO capital or something like that. I don't think he's going to target in that way. I think what he would do is he would authorize the use of what we call tactical nuclear weapons, which are still very devastating and could have huge impact on millions of, not just have an impact on the direct soldiers it's used on, but have direct impact on millions of civilians, not just in Ukraine, but even Europe, because it could have a fallout and so forth. So it would be still, make no mistake, even though tactical are considered smaller nukes, they can still have a lot of devastating effects. But I think it becomes likelier he could use something like that. The idea behind it is it would be a way to basically force Ukraine to say, that's it, we want to end this. We're done. And it would allow him to be able to reach some sort of deal that would be acceptable and face safe, namely to where he could occupy and now control the eastern provinces of Ukraine. Ukraine would be willing to not try to retake them. Might be some sort of nuanced thing where they're not going to recognize Russia's right to it, but they're not going to try to retake it. It could be something along those lines. That would be the most likely scenario where I could see a nuclear weapon being used, would be along those lines to basically force an ending, basically to try to scare not just Ukraine, but also Ukraine's supporters in the West, the NATO allies who have been arming and equipping Ukraine. That I think that would be the idea behind him using it. So I think it is a legitimate possibility. Again, I want to emphasize, I think this is a low probability event. It is rising. It is higher now than it was even a week ago. It's higher now than it was a year ago, but it's still a low probability event. The most likely course, and as I wrote in the World Politics Review piece that you just mentioned today, is just that this points to an unwillingness to end the war, right? And I've been saying this for a while, that Russia can't really win the war, but they don't have to lose it. And in many ways, that is enough. If they can just continue to hold on, they could possibly create the conditions of what we call a frozen conflict, where basically they effectively have control of the eastern provinces of Ukraine, even though there's no truce, there's no formal peace treaty or anything, but just the two sides kind of have forces stationed. There's intermediate fighting. you could almost think about like a little bit more of what you could call a kinetic situation of like what's on the Korean Peninsula, right? Where there's no formal peace treaty, the two sides there, there's the DMZ, and you could envision some sort of situation like that. So I think that is kind of where things are going, but there's still this possibility that it could go more extreme. And in that case, that would be the use of a tactical nuclear weapon.